You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London, and today we're talking about the impact of consumption on the climate. Britain says it's doing its bit to fight global warming because its greenhouse gas emissions fell by 19% between 1990 and 2008. But not everyone agrees. The environmentalist George Monbiot says that figure doesn't include the environmental impact of goods that we consume but which are made abroad. With the processes used to make those goods included, he says our emissions actually rose by 20%. However, some people say it is possible to decouple economic growth from material consumption. They say the UK has passed the point of maximum consumption, and technological advances mean the products we use last longer and are lighter and easier to recycle. So, what's the truth? Are we consuming more or less stuff? Is it having an increasing impact on the global climate? And do we need to rethink our way of life? With me in the studio to discuss this are Simon Ross, Chief Executive of the group Population Matters, Dr. Phil Longhurst, Senior Lecturer in Waste Strategy at Cranfield University, and Chris Goodall, author and commentator on sustainability. So, I'd like to ask my guests, in a word, is our consumption lifestyle having an increasing impact on the environment? Dr. Phil Longhurst.
What a good question. We are having an increased impact, but that's partly due to legacy of waste and materials as well as our consumption. And we're not really challenging directly the sources of consumption. We reduce our consumption when economic activity falls, and we try and reduce it as activity grows, but it's a very difficult route to follow.
Chris Goodall.
Well, my research suggests that actually we passed the point of peak consumption in the UK over 10 years ago. The early part of the last decade was the time when we were buying most stuff, both stuff made domestically and stuff imported from overseas. I'm not saying the problem is solved, but it's quite clear to me, looking at the data, despite what George Monbiot said, that we're actually seeing a decline, and probably quite a rapid decline, in the economy's impact on the environment.
Simon Ross.
I think our impact on the environment is still increasing, partly because every year there's another 500,000 of us living in the UK, and that's affecting things in all sorts of ways. So although we are getting more efficient in some ways, the impact is still increasing.
All right, Chris Goodall, you said there that your research contrasts with what George Monbiot has found in his article. Would you like to unpack that a little bit?
Yes, what George suggested, to recapitulate, is that although domestic emissions, that is to say the greenhouse gases put out by the British economy in Britain, have tended to fall at a fairly regular rate of 1-2% a year over the last 20 years, the total impact of UK consumption is also felt in other parts of the world where things are being made for us. And it's not just iPads in China, it's food from Brazil, it's textiles from Bangladesh. Now, if you look at the total amount of material coming into the UK from abroad, it's tending to decline and has been declining since 2004 in weight terms. Yes, we continue to consume much more from abroad than almost any other country in the world, and we need to measure the impact of that. But the evidence is, despite what George Monbiot said, that the peak of our total emissions, both domestically caused and internationally generated, passed in the early part of the last decade. And funnily enough, that's what official statistics say. The DEFRA, Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, data that was done very independently by the University of Leeds shows a clear fall of about 20%, almost 20%, in the period since 2004 in the net emissions caused by consumption in the UK economy.
Dr. Phil Longhurst, does that chime with what you're seeing?
The trend is certainly to achieve a better decoupling, if you like, from materials, consumption and our production. So we're getting better and better at manufacturing with less waste and also recovering goods. And if you look at the recycling perspective in terms of materials recovered in the UK, that's achieved levels which we've never seen before, so 40-50% of household waste. But that picture also ignores some of the other challenges which we've not really overcome. So if we look at a consumption argument, we're improving. If you look at a disposal argument, we still have a long way to go. And household waste consumption is only approximately 9% in the UK, commercial and industrial around 12 to 14%, and we're still prepared to throw away large volumes of that material, which has a similar composition to many of our household materials. So the challenge really is for us, if we manufacture in the UK or we import, what happens to those materials at the end of life? And do we have systems in place to recover, recycle or reuse those materials?
I just want to ask, that's the picture for Britain, but what about globally for the whole world? What do you see happening there?
Yeah, at the moment, the challenge for developing countries and rapidly developing countries, which in fact have smaller population footprints, if you like, in terms of material, carbon emissions and water, the natural trend is for those to increase closer to our own footprint. And if that does happen, then we won't be able to sustain the levels of consumption that we presently have. Even though countries like India and China have much lower footprints per population. So the challenge is how we achieve well-being and societal growth and development and health, whilst not seeing that as being consumption growth in essence.
That's right, isn't it, Simon Ross? Your group, Population Matters, says we should not increase the world's population too much, but actually large quantities of the world's population already consume much less than we do. Surely it would be more effective for us to change our own lifestyles.
We certainly will have to. Globally, population is still growing very rapidly in developing countries. There will be another couple of billion people in the next 50 years or so. And of course, per capita consumption is rising as they industrialise. And that's why we're seeing resource prices rising. So for a country like Britain with a balance of trade deficit, that's going to become increasingly difficult for us. In Britain, we will have to look at our resource use and our population to live within a globe that's much more heavily consuming.
But couldn't we consume less?
I think individually we can look at our per capita consumption and try and be more environmentally aware, recycle more and so on. Because nobody's that keen on seeing the living standards fall. That's one thing we should certainly do. But I think the other thing we should be doing is think about having smaller families as well.
Chris Goodall, a declining population, would that be good for our consumption society's impact on the environment or not?
Well, what I've never understood about the Population Matters thesis is what they would do to stop the world population increasing from approximately 7.1 billion today to approximately 9.5 billion by 2050. Now, anything that we could actually do to slow the already rapidly slowing rate of population growth would be authoritarian. The best way of adjusting the rate of population growth is giving females the right to make a decision about their fertility. And the best way of achieving that is economic growth. Once you've done that, you've given females the opportunity to decide how many children to have. You find universally around the world that they decide to have fewer children. We have to face the fact that we need to cope with over 9 billion people by 2050. My research, written about in a book I've just published called Sustainability, suggests that we easily can cope in most respects with the demands of 9 billion people, even 9 billion people who have a Western lifestyle. We can cope with that perfectly adequately, and we should expect to be able to do so. The one thing we can't do, however, is decarbonise the economy fast enough unless we take radical measures to stop burning fossil fuel.
Is that something that we can do in our current sort of condition of society and energy mix and resource availability?
Yeah, well, this is the big challenge of this century. It's going to be very, very difficult to move away from fossil fuels as the primary source of energy production and consumption across the world. However, there's absolutely no doubt in the OECD countries, the rich countries of the Western world, energy consumption has already peaked and is probably declining everywhere except Australia. It's certainly declining quite rapidly in this country and elsewhere, and we should expect that to continue. We are also seeing rapid, massive increases in energy efficiency in the main developing countries, particularly China. So although China, yes, is consuming more, it's doing so more, particularly more coal, the rate of increase has slowed to almost nothing. It's a little-known fact that Chinese electricity consumption last year was lower than in 2011. This mystique about China, that's not right. The myth about China that it's not worried about energy efficiency, that it's churning out greenhouse gases and ignoring the implications of climate change is utterly and totally wrong. So if the OECD is increasing, China's decreasing its energy consumption, China's getting hold of the problem, I'm optimistic that within 20 years, we will have at least caused fossil fuel emissions to start to fall. We need to do so faster if we're going to control global warming, but we have the problem. At least we have the problem in our sights now.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London, and today we're talking about the impact of consumption on the climate. Phil Longhurst, is it the case that China gets a bad press?
Undoubtedly. If you look at all of the industries in China and the way they're developing, they're making leap changes in development and technology. It's very easy to look at our reporting of China's activities and its industry as if it's poor, low technology development. The Chinese are very aware of the technology that's capable and are very focused on new innovation. And in fact, they're seeking and they recognise the limits to their economic and industrial growth are the environment and pollution, and the ability to deliver an advanced infrastructure they're very focused on. If you look at the development and design of new cities, they're very focused on water reduction, water recovery, better use of materials, low energy, efficient living in terms of footprint per population. And in a way which we're not in the UK, interestingly. If you look at the UK's consumption of energy in terms of light and heating at the household, we're probably one of the worst in Europe. And yet we look across to other countries as if they are wasting energy, and our own housing infrastructure, our own industrial infrastructure is very poor in that respect.
But if it's the case that Britain, which is a mature economy, is reducing its overall use of materials, and China, which is a rapidly developing economy, is also apparently reducing its consumption of electricity, as we've just heard, then where in the world is the actual increase in consumption of stuff and resources coming from?
Well, we have a growing, if the wrong, it's a poor phrase, but a growing middle class, if you like, or a growing belt of consumers across the world. People who are now finding living and security in living, where no longer large numbers of their family are dying. They can have food and water and basic health provision, means that families have a more stable and a better choice around their lives, which is a reflection of the migration of Chinese families from the agricultural areas into cities. Cities offer a greater stability and a greater choice in lifestyle. In fact, as Chris described, greater opportunities for education as well. So I think cities can be very good at efficiently delivering a living experience. We have to think about how we develop our cities for the next generation. What are our next cities going to look like in the UK as well? Are we going to rely on a modified Victorian infrastructure, or do we look at new city development?
Simon Ross, what do you make of what we've just heard?
I'm not as optimistic as some of the others. I'm thinking ahead to declining water resources, things like melting glaciers and water tables. The fact that a lot of agriculture depends on energy, which is getting more and more expensive. The fact that there are limited resources in terms of potassium and phosphates for fertiliser. So I think there's real concerns about a mismatch between rising demand and limited resources.
But perhaps in the future, the dishwashers and so on of the future will be more energy efficient and less polluting, or delivering a lighter footprint in terms of the processes required to create them.
I think technological innovation's definitely got a place to play. Increased resource efficiency, lightweighting, moving to digital technologies, for example. So we need to look at technology, we need to look at greater equality, and we need to look at population as well.
Chris Goodall, I'd like to ask, you're optimistic, but still, are there not some wasteful habits that we have in the UK that must change?
Absolutely, massive wasteful habits. But we were talking a few minutes ago about the increase in recycling from households. What we're also seeing is actually a smaller volume of waste being delivered from households. We're actually producing less waste. I'm not saying the situation is perfect, but we're now moving from being a laggard in Europe to being one of the most advanced countries when it comes to recycling and reusing things. So absolutely. So the world has to move from an economic system which says things are dug out of the ground, turned into metal, created as products, sold to customers and then thrown away at some stage in the future. We need to move across the world to seeing our economy as essentially a circular system, which doesn't involve continuous mining of new resources and throwing away into landfill. We've got a very long way to go. There's absolutely no doubt about it, but we know roughly how we're going to do it, and we need to accelerate that path as fast as we can.
It's an interesting point, and I entirely agree. I think one of the challenges we have in a circular economy is that expands the ownership of the problem to the complete supply chain. At the moment, we have many cases where the supply chain only owns the waste problem when it brings material in from the country and starts to assemble the product. As we end up with this circular economy which draws material from around the globe, manufactures in one place, assembles in another, uses in another, and perhaps disposes at that location, it starts to challenge where do those material go and who owns the problem to start with. We have opportunities in technology to improve that. So we will have, in the near future, better disassembly technologies to take products apart, better reuse and recovery of materials. And the point that Simon was making about shortage of materials, we're getting better about taking them out of the waste supply chain. But it still raised the question of who owns those products in the first place and how do we return them back into the cycle for use. And some companies have started to look more carefully about the custody of materials right the way from where they first source through to the entire supply chain. And that's a very interesting development globally. And in fact will really be the development because our global companies have more influence and more leverage than our national governments and can make decisions much more rapidly.
Is this something that's happening because companies are realising that they can save money or make money, or is it happening because they are truly motivated to save the planet, as it were?
No, it's not an ethical. This is really not an ethical thing. It's the fact that copper, for example, has suddenly become very expensive. The price has fallen in the last few weeks, but we're talking about a 5 times multiplication in the price of copper. So it becomes economically rational when things get
business risk
sourced.
reduction.
Yeah, it is. So I'm just looking at this phone in front of me here. Now, at the moment, there's almost nothing in this Samsung phone, 2.5 years old, that is broadly speaking recyclable. But there's also nothing in there that couldn't be designed to make a fully recyclable product within a couple of years. And it's absolutely clear that the main manufacturers around the world realise there's now an economic incentive. Instead of selling me a phone which I then abuse and throw away, in giving me a phone which will last for a considerable length of time, but also when it comes to the end of its life, I can then recycle, and every single rare earth or bit of copper or platinum in this extraordinarily important and influential device will then be reused. And that's the same both in the UK as the rest of the world. And we need to think about building systems which completely allow complete recycling and complete circularity for every single thing we use.
Simon Ross, I mean, doesn't this show us that if resources do become more expensive, we adapt to the new reality?
I think the market does have these feedback mechanisms, so rising resource prices does make recycling more viable. It also deadens and discourages demand, so it does have those things. But the rising resource prices are a signal. There's a signal that as we extract more and more, it gets more and more expensive to get things out the ground from where they are. They're in more remote or difficult to access places. And it's also a reflection of enormously rising demand on a global scale. So sure, the West and the most developed countries are getting more efficient, but you've got this huge weight of unmet demand from developing countries. And that's the concern.
What I try to show in the book that I published recently called Sustainability was that there isn't an enormous overhang of excess demand waiting for people. Once people have got access to a certain quantity of steel, of copper, of the main industrial materials, they don't need any more. There isn't an infinitely expanding need for the main materials that which we dug out of the economy. So yes, it's going to be a struggle to give a decent lifestyle to 9 billion people eventually, whereas we're only giving it to 1 or 2 billion at the moment. But there's absolutely no absolute shortage of resources, provided we use them properly and don't use fossil fuels to process those materials and reprocess them. It's a problem we should be able to cope with.
Isn't it necessary for very developed countries to provide some kind of inspiring example to sort of obviously do their bit, as it were?
Well, we are. The resource use is declining in this country. It's declining quite fast. And partly that's a function of the economic circumstances over the last 5 years. But the trends were absolutely obvious even before that. You look at every single graph and you see a slowing growth and then a flattening and then a decline in resource utilisation, in energy use. Indeed, the distance we choose to travel each year is falling. The amount of food we eat in terms of calories per head is falling.
Is that the case? Surely everybody's jumping on Ryanair flights and going off for weekends every second
month. The total
month.
amount of travel is tending to fall in every single industrial country.
Why is that?
Because travel isn't something that most of us want to do. Travel is actually a deeply unattractive activity. Yes, going away on holiday to Spain in April is a wonderful thing, and it's a wonderful opportunity for us to have. But in general, most travel we'd rather not do. You came in here, no doubt. You had to commute in here. Would you rather have lived your life?
Well, I've tried working from home. It's actually quite boring.
Yes, but you don't choose to commute. It is not a pleasurable activity. And once we get sufficiently well off, we choose to travel less. And that's not just the case in the UK. It's true in every single industrial economy.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London, and today we're talking about the impact of consumption on the climate. With me are Dr. Phil Longhurst, Senior Lecturer in Waste Strategy at Cranfield University, Chris Goodall, author and commentator on sustainability, and Simon Ross, Chief Executive of the group Population Matters.
One of the best technologies in the last 50 years is family planning, is the pill, the condom and so on. We all know how that works. It's very popular. Now, if we can use that and improve women's rights, particularly in developing countries, to bring down the birth rate to 1 or 2 per head, which is what most people are happy with, is what we see in the UK, for example, that's going to have the biggest impact on dampening demand and means that we don't have to struggle so much finding every little solution to hold down that demand.
Simon, it's already happening. In most developing countries now, the rate of replacement, to call it at its crudest, is now not far off 2 children per woman. The decline in the rate of population increase has been staggering over the last 30 years, and we're continuing to see it.
Well, we're still growing at the rate of 1.5 million a week globally. So it's still growing, and a lot of that's due to population momentum, the fact there's an awful lot of young people around now. It is slowing, but what we can do is help it to slow faster, to reduce that peak, bring that peak forward, peak population, make it lower, and reduce this huge demand there is on resources.
Phil Longhurst, George Monbiot surely has a point in as far as he says that there's a misleading perception of how countries impact the environment, and that even though it's clear that we live in a very integrated world now, people still think in national terms about their country's performance and therefore whether or not they're doing their bit.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And in fact, we think in local terms. We think about our waste, our bin, our disposal, our consumption, and we don't think of the collective impacts of those. We have got better at using less materials. I don't wholly agree that we don't want to travel, but I enjoy travel. But I think we are restricted by choice by different drivers. We're restricted by choice by the comfort and pleasantness of travel, and as more of us travel, that becomes less attractive, and the economics. And we're seeing, for example, just in material disposal, we've seen huge reductions since the economic downfall in 2008. So we have to be careful about mixing up economic activity and decline in economic activity with what are genuine achievements in efficiency. But taking a global perspective or taking a wider perspective on each material is a really tricky choice at the household. If we go around the supermarket, we want to pick up products, like them, put them in our basket. We don't really want to dwell on every source, every feedstock, every product as we go through. We need people to take custody of those choices for us. And that becomes a problem because individual governments have very small levers to make those changes. Companies are pretty good at making those changes, but the exposure of the arguments to make those companies or encourage those companies become very important. So we've seen big changes where companies have made a positive impact on feedstock choice. So we can make a difference. In governments, we've got some great examples of making a difference in energy. For example, Kyoto, regardless of all its criticism, encouraged us to help other countries reduce their carbon emissions. The landfill tax in the UK, as well as all the criticism of it, encouraged us to throw away less and think about what we throw away. So we've got good government metrics at an international and national scale, and we've got some good examples in commerce. If you ask an economist, will we run out of materials? Will we run out of petrol? Will we run out of gas? Usually the answer is we'll never run out, it'll just cost you more to get it. And the reality of that is we have to accept either less choice or a lower living standard. And that's really the constraint we're facing.
But also, have we increased the global temperature on average up to a point where we now face disaster? I mean, it's all very well hearing about the increased recycling in Britain, but is it enough?
Absolutely not. If we continue doing things as we're doing, we are going to face 4 or 5 degrees of global warming by the end of this century. In other words, our grandchildren are going to face an almost uninhabitable planet. So I don't wish to be at all optimistic about this. This is the most difficult challenge the world has ever faced. But it's a challenge that we at least have some of the technological tools to begin dealing with. Whether we do so as a planet is absolutely uncertain. We certainly haven't made much progress in the last few years. But nevertheless, we need to focus on the things which really matter. And principally, that's the consumption of fossil fuels. How
happy are you with the state of global affairs in terms of sustainability versus the possibility of climate change and associated catastrophe on a sort of scale of 1 to 100? How chuffed are you with where we're at, Simon Ross?
I think more and more people are talking the right game, but the actions haven't yet really started in a lot of cases. So I'm half and half about the future.
Chris Goodall.
Oh, I'm deeply pessimistic, but I'm only deeply pessimistic about fossil fuel consumption. Everything else appears to me to be quite easily manageable. Fossil fuel consumption is the most enormous challenge, and I don't think we quite understood how fast we're going to have to change.
And Phil Longhurst.
Yeah. I'm on a positive side of the 50-50, and say 60%. I think it is achievable, but we mustn't see this issue as just a technical or just an economic. These are environmental and social issues as well. And I think we've started on the right path, but each of the solutions are complicated, and we need to continue to keep the presence and discussion of these.
All right, I'd like to thank my guests, Simon Ross, Chief Executive of the group Population Matters, Chris Goodall, author and commentator on sustainability, and Dr. Phil Longhurst, a Senior Lecturer in Waste Strategy at Cranfield University. Thank you all very much.